Well, as everyone kind of trickles in, I'm just going to list off a couple quick points here. For people who are in the previous webinar, I'm sorry, you're going to have to listen to me go through this whole spiel again. Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone is well and safe. That's, especially for everyone joining us out east. Thank you all so much. Glad you could make it. So here, a couple quick housekeeping items. We're going to be doing a live Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to submit your questions in the text box that's in your webinar control panel. You'll see the questions drop down there. We always try to get to as many as possible in the hour, but if we can't get to it, we will follow up via email to make sure you do get answers. All questions are addressed anonymously. Quick disclaimer, all information discussed in this webinar is for educational purposes only. It should not be applied directly to the administration of any particular file or claim. The webinar is being recorded, and we're going to be posting it on our website, LinkedIn, and YouTube pages, so please feel free to pass them on to your colleagues or use them in team meetings if you wish. We're going to be sending everyone a completion certificate probably next week. We try to do it as quickly as possible, so please bear with us. For continuing education credits, this one is accredited in Manitoba and BC, and we are just waiting to hear back from Alberta and Saskatchewan. Don't foresee any problems getting accreditation, so just sit tight, and we will get those to you as soon as possible. At the end of the webinar, when you close the GoToWebinar control panel, you're going to be prompted with a survey, which is a couple quick questions. We always really appreciate getting everyone's feedback and insights. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out, we'd very much appreciate it. And that just brings me to one almost last point. About a month from now, October 26th, we're going to be hosting our 6th annual national tour. This is a virtual tour, again, like we've done the last couple of years. We're going to be focusing on equipment failures and component malfunctions this year. We have a terrific group of presenters this year who are going to kind of go into different disciplines and looking at it from different angles. So you do not want to miss that. At the end of the webinar, you're going to be asked in that same survey if you want us to sign you up. So just select yes if you are interested, and we'll automatically have you registered. And finally, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, you can email our team at webinar@origin-and-cause.com, or just use the question box in the control panel. Okay, let's get started. Clinton, would you mind just going to the next slide? So today, breaking down the code, applying the building and fire code to claims. Our presenter is Clinton DeBroy. Clinton is a certified fire inspector with experience conducting, enforcing, and reporting fire code requirements within all residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial buildings. He also has his building code qualification in fire protection within the province of Ontario. Has completed plan examinations and onset inspections of active and passive fire protection systems to ensure compliance with current regulations. He's a fire sprinkler designer with experience engineering and reviewing water-based fire protection systems for residential, complex, mixed, major occupancies, commercial and industrial buildings. And he has conducted thorough on-site investigations of fire protection systems used in commercial cooking operations, and completed numerous in-depth failure analyses reviewing fire protection system requirements within existing buildings to verify compliance with applicable bylaws, acts, and regulations. So without further ado, Clinton DeBroy.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. Okay, so we'll get going here, guys. So with today's agenda, we'll be looking at how do building and fire codes become law. We'll also be looking at the passive and active fire protection systems, just going through a few different types of systems that we have out there, that there's not just one type. There's a couple different types of systems that we'll be focusing on. And then we'll also look at how they're applied in a claim scenario. So we'll do that through a case study. And we'll also be looking at who is responsible for code compliance. I'm sure that's a big question that everybody has, so we'll be looking at that as well. Okay, so the first thing we'll look at is So how do codes become law? So if we look here, we understanding of how codes become law will help determine what codes or standards are required. So every code we use has something that backs it up to make it an official document. So in Alberta, they have the Safety Codes Act, BC has the Building Code Act and Fire Services Act, Nova Scotia has the Building Code Act and Fire Safety Act, et cetera, et cetera. So every province kind of has their own acts, okay, that back these up. So each one of these acts determines what code is enforced, okay, and more specifically, the version of the code that's being adopted. So we're going to look at some acts and codes, but because we are limited on time, we will look into more of the Ontario regulations and acts, okay? Um, Please note that the process to create an act and regulation is pretty much identical across each province. So even though we are being very Ontario specific here, it will reciprocate to everybody right across the board, okay? Okay, so now we know how acts and regulations are created and the day they are enforced. Here's an outline of the duties and responsibilities of the MMAH, or it's also called Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. The ministry in Ontario are held responsible to update and maintain the Act and regulations. Okay, so here, these are kind of the roles that they have. So we have develop and maintain the qualification registration. So for system for building practitioners, including we have building officials, certain classes of designers, on-site sewage system installers, registered code agencies. But as noted below, one thing that they don't do is the province does not oversee the enforcement activities of municipalities, okay? So that strictly lies in the municipality, okay? So what is that exactly? So they do not enforce any of those provisions that set out by the municipality. An example would be the permit process and potentially charging persons for construction without a permit. When to obtain a permit is usually spelled out in their website or by just simply contacting them directly. So if you have any questions, sometimes just literally just contacting the municipality will provide a lot of those answers. Okay, so the next thing that we have here, there is a slight difference between the last ministry's responsibilities and this one. So we talked about what those are for them enforcing the act and the regulation. Here we have the OFM, so the Ontario Fire Marshal's Office is a branch of the Ministry of the Solicitor General. Okay, so another ministry that it falls under. The ministry oversees the Ontario Fire Marshal, but the act specifically mentions the Fire Marshal's responsibilities. Okay, so these are some of the responsibilities. So they are responsible for the Fire Protection and Prevention Act, the Fire Code, okay, providing advice and assistance on the application and enforcement of the legislation, managing an appeals process, so for orders received under the Fire Protection and Prevention Act, and also providing administrative services to the Fire Safety Commission. So regulations provide support to the legislation and are enforceable through those acts. So those acts that we just mentioned. So unlike the legislation, so those acts of legislation that we looked at, regulations are not made by parliaments. This is a little bit of a difference here, but rather by persons or bodies that parliament has given the authority to make them an act. So such as the governor and council or minister. This is why regulations are developed under a separate process from those acts. So they're actually developed a little bit separate from that, okay? Once the act is adopted as law, regulations are enforced under the act, okay? So they're enforced through those acts like we saw. So we have the building code and fire code, and they have those acts that back them up, okay? So for instance, so the Building Code Act, of course, we talk about the Ontario Building Code. The same would be for other provinces, right? They have an act and then they have a regulation. That regulation's a code, and that act kind of backs up that regulation, okay? So that's what makes it into law. And we also have the Fire Protection and Prevention Act. So we look at that as the fire code, right? So again, we have other ones like the Fire Services Act or the Fire Safety Act. So again, they have provisions under there. So instead of it being, say, predominantly like what we have here in Ontario as this, the Ontario Fire Code, it would be more of a national model code, right? So more of the provinces use the model codes rather than specifically tailored to that province like Ontario does, okay? Also, you can't use an old regulation under the current act, Okay, so old regulations are revoked to make way for current adoption. So something else to look at as well. A revoked regulation may extend its application in certain circumstances or may have application in relation to certain past events. So I'll give you kind of an example of that. So say for instance, I had the 2006 Ontario Building Code, and that was revoked the day that the 2012 was enforced. Any building built prior to or permit established before that 2012 was enforced would be required to meet the 2006 regulation at that time and not the current regulation. Okay. So here's a kind of a continuation. So we looked at where do regulations come from. So I did touch base a little bit on the National Model Code. So that's adopted as whole or modified. Okay. So the National Model Code, so that's published by the National Research Council of Canada and developed by the Canadian Commission of Building and Fire Codes. Okay, so that's the committee that comes together that actually puts together these codes. Okay, so it's all different stakeholders that they gather to put their heads together to find out how do we make this code work. Okay. And the National Model Code establishes kind of that baseline, but it's not legally binding. So just because they make it doesn't mean that every province will use it unless they adopt it. It's kind of like through that act that we looked at. So once they have an act, they adopt it through that act, and that becomes the adopted code, so that adopted law in that specific province, okay? The ministry is responsible for the acts are also responsible for the regulations that support the legislation. So regulations are filed with the register and provided a number. Okay, so this is more for everybody to know where those numbers come from. So here in Ontario, we have regulation file number, so we call it OREG 21307 as amended. So just an example would be the Ontario Building Code. So let's go with that one. So OREG 33212. So what does it mean really? So all that 33212 regulation, so that is a number that means that's the number that it was filed for in that particular year of 2012. So the regulation itself wasn't enforced until actually 2 years after the day it was filed, which is January 1st, 2014. Okay, so just in case you're wondering, so we'll go back to this fire code. So that this regulation, as we looked at, is 21307 as amended. And amended, all that means, so you may have a regulation that says, well, you look at it, this is a 2015 code. What does that mean exactly? So, well, that just means that they put 2015 on the cover, but it's still that 2013-07 regulation that just continuously is being amended, which is a lot easier than just creating a brand new regulation right off the hop. So that means the original regulation has changed in some aspects since the day it was filed. So for example, prior to October 14th, 2014, there was no provisions in the fire code for carbon monoxide alarms, okay? So until the introduction of OREG 194.14, so 194th in the year 2014, the latest amendment to date is 319.22, so 319th edition of the year 2022, which strikes out. So all that means all they did was they struck out Long-Term Care Homes Act, and they replaced that with Fixing Long-Term Care Act 2021. So that's all they did for that new regulation. So unlike the building code, the fire code is retroactive, which means that any addition to the regulation affects all existing buildings, okay? And I know many, many people have mentioned it to me, and I'm sure others have mentioned it out in the field. But because this has been brought up so many times, grandfathering, I'm sure everybody's heard of that term, grandfathering, before. It's not defined term in the fire code, and the use of it generally suggests it's being exempt from those certain requirements that it has to follow. So if the building process or other meets the appropriate application, then it must comply regardless of the age of the building, okay? So that's kind of where I get that term grandfathering, and I throw that term out because I look, does it apply or does it not? If it applies, it's in. If it doesn't, then it doesn't have to meet it, period, okay? So now that we kind of went over that part, I'm going to show you a little bit of those passive and active fire protection systems, okay? So here we have both of these systems play a huge pivotal role in fire protection. You have to understand the fundamentals of these two separate systems that play a crucial part in fire and life safety. So if we look kind of here at this example, so if you look on the left side, it's a passive system. You have through penetrations, mechanical tracks, gypsum, alternate enclosures, joints, thermal insulation. What does that mean? Anything that really constitutes a system that's more or less walls or passing through, so fire stopping, which would be through those through penetrations, things like that, really come into the passive. And I'll get into a little bit more in that a few other slides. And the other system that we're looking at on the right-hand side really is that clean agent system. We also have a total pack system, so we look at that as well. Those are the active systems, but of course, again, we'll get into that a little bit more further down in the slides, okay? So here we have passive fire protection, okay? So the definition of passive really is fire protection does not require any external power, so no external power at all, but relies instead on specific construction features. So basically passive systems are the basics of fire containment, okay? So we have to look at that containment, right? Like a room. Without a proper passive system, a fire would not be contained and could easily spread, so basically from one area right to an adjacent area. So penetrations in a fire separations are known as avenues to permit fire spread to other areas, right? A penetration can be typically cable or pipe runs, doors or windows. These features require a listed fire stop or closure conforming to code. An example would be a fire door. So we have the picture that we have here is a fire door. A proper fire door would be constructed to minimize those passage of flames and smoke from spreading into the common egress corridor. Okay, so that passive system helps prevent that fire from spreading from that one room and going right to an adjacent area, right? So in this case, say an exit or egress corridor that potentially has a lot of traffic flow, we don't want that spread going there, right? We want to be as safe as possible, especially when we're exiting somewhere. So here is an example of a passive. I know it looks a little complex, but of a passive fire protection feature. So this listed system meets the requirements of the Ontario Building Code. So this is a bearing wall, so load bearing wall assembly. So just an example. If constructed as per the design number U312, it will have a rating of 1 hour. Okay, so we can see that there's a 1 hour rating. This is a typical construction that we look at that would be a 1 hour rated assembly, okay? Now going a little bit further into that, so we have our passive fire resistance ratings and fire protection ratings. So you're kind of wondering yourself, well, what really is the difference between these two? So they're not one of those terms that are interchangeable. They really do mean two different things. So if you're talking about a fire resistance rating, a fire protection rating, you're talking about two different types of systems, okay? So if we look a little bit into the one system, which is a fire resistance rating, we can see it's a standard method of fire endurance test of building construction and materials. So really, if we look at that, we see that person's hand on that wall, so that kind of simulating. Well, that's because it's actually tested as an assembly. So it's not only retarding that fire from going from one area to the next in the smoke, but that heat transfer, right? So we think about fires on one side of that wall, heck, it's going to get hot on that other side of the wall. So we got to build an assembly that not only can deal with the fire on the one side, but can also deal with that heat transfer on the other side as well. Because, you know, it's not only touching it, what if they have combustible material on the other side of that wall and that's touching the wall? Well, if it gets really hot, now we have two separate fires. And how did we have two separate fires? Well, potentially then you could have a fault in your wall. And if it was supposed to be a fire separation, that wall is supposed to be some type of tested to some standard, right? Same thing, so we look at the fire protection rating, right? So this is a little different. So we have a bunch of windows here. Well, generally a fire protection rating would just mean that it's tested to rate for that passage of flame or smoke. But if you put your hand on the other side of it, it's still going to be pretty hot, right? So that's where it becomes a fire protection rating. It's two different types of testing that they use between these different standards, okay? So really a wall is just a whole bunch of those fire protection ratings put together, tested, and there you go. There's your fire resistance rating of that fire separation. So here, so what does this all mean? You know, just in case you're all confused. Okay, so you can't make a hamburger without the stuff between the buns, really. Okay, so if you look at this, let's look at this fantastic, delicious burger. Okay, so also known as a wall assembly. So if we look closer at the burger, so we have kind of the buns or the walls, right? So we have the Type X drywall, you know, the patty, the veggies, or we can call it wood studs and insulation. Okay, put it all together and voila, there you go, there's your hamburger. If we take the same concept, so that same thinking concept, and think what we need to for fire separation, so in order to complete the package, we need something on both sides, right? Something in the middle to make it, to create that fire resistance rating. So I'll give you kind of that example. So if I constructed a wall, so if you take that wall on the right-hand side, for instance, so if I constructed a wall and added 12.7 millimeter Type-X drywall, right? We always hear the word Type-X. So I'm going to use 12.7. And according to the building code, that's going to give me 25 minutes. Perfect. So if I needed a 30-minute separation, then why not add two pieces on one side, right? That's got to be good, right? Well, that would be wrong. So because to construct a fire separation, we require, remember, all the components together to construct it properly to not only stop that spread of fire from one area to the next, remember that heat transfer I talked about too? So we got to look at the whole assembly, not just one face of it, okay? So we dealt with a little bit of passive. Now let's look at these active fire protection systems. So here, the definition of this, the operation of an active fire protection device requires manual, mechanical, or electrical power. Okay, so for example, a sprinkler system requires sprinklers to open and a water supply at sufficient flow rate and a pressure after activation to be delivered through the system. A smoke control system relies on roof vents that open or a mechanical system to operate when a fire is detected. And a detection and fire an alarm system requires electrical power, right, to operate that system. So fire sprinkler systems, one of the common systems that we are really definitely familiar with. Fire sprinkler systems are designed to protect a specific hazard classification, and that's generally identified within NFPA 13. Okay, so the most common system and widely used is a wet system, which means it always has water present in that system. Okay, the second system that you may encounter is a dry system. So here I'll show you, get that laser pointer for you, and here you go. So this is your wet system over here. Here's your dry system over here. So a dry system, all that means is that it doesn't have any water in the system. Typically in an area that it's located, it doesn't have heat and is definitely prone to freezing temperatures. So example, underground or above ground parking garages. So that's where we'd see this guy here. And since we live in an area that has 4 seasons, typically it does get pretty cold. So if I had water in this and in an area that was exposed, say in a parking garage, that would freeze and then I would have a lot more problems on my hand. Okay, a few other systems to keep in mind. Okay, there are 3 different types of, these are called pre-action systems. Okay, and we have a deluge system. So these are very specialized systems that you're not always going to run into, but just be aware that there are those systems out there. So for example, this pre-action system, which looks pretty complex, but don't let looks deceive you. It's not as bad as you think. So the pre-action systems, you have those 3 different types. You have a non-interlock. So all that means is that you're going to have a detector or you're going to have automatic sprinklers go off. Very similar to what you would with a dry system. But now this is where it comes a little different, is you got singles and doubles. Okay, so in order for this system to go off with a single interlock or a double interlock, you're going to have some type of detector to go off. Okay, so that detection is usually from a fire alarm, and that is going to send water into that piping network. Okay, and then the system over here, that's a deluge system, and we're going to get into that in right now. So the deluge system design process. So this is interesting. So keep in mind that these systems are not just thought of. The design process is very complex. Okay, so there's a lot going on. So a designer would have to obtain a building classification. So you can't really do something unless you know what the building is. Find the hazard classification. So what exactly am I protecting? What's the hazard involved here? And then you have that relevant standards and apply all the information in the standard as applicable to that specific hazard, right? So sometimes a hazard such as a hanger is identified in not only NFPA 13, but it also directs you to NFPA 409. So 409 is a standard for aircraft hangers, which we can see on the screen right here. And don't forget about regulatory bodies. So this is another thing too, is that we seem to always want to design everything, oh, there's a standard for it, perfect. But we also have in this country and others as well, regulatory bodies such as Transport Canada in this case, or even the Canadian Forces Fire Marshal for that matter. They actually have certain designations, certain requirements, standards that you have to meet that may require specific requirements at or above the actual standard itself. So I know I may have lost a lot of you here, so that's okay. I'm going to show you a couple of videos on how these things operate. So some pretty cool videos to actually see what they look like. And just to let you know, they might be a little bit loud. So if it is too loud, please feel free to turn down your volume or mute it. It's up to you. I would suggest to keep the volume on because it does have a little bit of background noise or information that may be valuable, okay? Okay, so as you can see in that system, that's a lot of foam in there. So that system in particular is called a high expansion foam system. And really it's protecting, remember that hanger that we looked at? That's what it'd be protecting. So you got to think about all those volatilities, those fuels, the airplanes in there. That's a lot. So that's why those standards kind of jump from that 13 and say, well, okay, what's a little bit more specialized in that? We're going to have to go to NFPA 409, and then we're going to have to look at, do we need a foam system? What kind of foam system? We have low, medium, high. So there's different types of systems out there. In this particular case, you had a high expansion system that's really taking care of that hanger. And as you can tell, there's a lot of foam that's being generated in there. So typically you can have over 10 feet of foam in there very easily because it's a high expansion. It's making sure to protect those hazards, to protect what's going on, okay? So the next thing we have here is I'm going to show you, I'm going to play this through. It's actually a clean agent system, and this clean agent system is protecting a server. So very specialized equipment, but there's also going to be a discharge of sprinklers, just to kind of show you the differences here, but to also let you know that there's clean agent systems that also are involved in these specialized systems for different areas. So just because you walk into somewhere, you have to realize, what kind of system am I actually getting into? What actually went on here? Do I have a lot of fire spread? Do I not have a lot of fire spread? What's in here? What's being protected? How is it being protected, right? So I'll give you, this is a little example of how a clean agent system operates. right, so I'm gonna stop it right there. So I just want to show you kind of those examples of what a clean agent does, where you might see them, and compare that to a water-based fire suppression system. So kind of those two examples that are going on. So where you would see one, where you'd see another, and a lot of these places that actually incorporate water-based fire protection systems, you have to remember, they generally put those throughout the entire structure. So in something like this, you might have that pre-action system. So you'd have a pre-action that's inside that server room because they don't want an accidental trip of water, but they also incorporate a clean agent system in there as well. And the reason why is because that clean agent system will go off first because you're using that air sampling system, or you're using that cross-zoning fire protection system. So that cross-zoning is off of a fire alarm system. Okay, and that all that means is that you have two different detectors that will go off to actually make the clean agent system go off and actually operate properly. Okay, so that's when you're going to get this clean agent to go off. It's going to work. Your backup is going to be a water-based fire protection system. So say if the clean agent fails or the door didn't close properly, okay, because they have that room integrity, right? So you got to remember those operate because it's in an enclosed environment. So if something for some reason isn't working, at least there's a backup to make sure that, yeah, your equipment's going to get kind of damaged, but at least the fire didn't spread beyond that area, right? Okay. So we're going to be looking at a little bit of the fire alarm systems, okay? So like sprinkler systems, these are very common in various types of buildings, from small apartment buildings, large commercial complexes. Two common fire alarm systems are the conventional and addressable systems. So example of an addressable system in an apartment complex would display the exact floor. So if we look over here, this is your addressable system, okay? So that's gonna actually tell me the exact floor, but also the exact location that the actual detector came into alarm. So for instance, that's gonna read up on my display here. It's gonna tell me, so if I have room, say 206, that's going to tell me if there's a detector in room 206, it's going to say that detector in room 206. So that was the first thing to go off. So that room right there. And then subsequent to that, I could have had maybe someone do a pull station, or maybe detector on the outside went off, but it's going to be a sequence of operations for the alarm. So it's going to tell me if I scroll, if I'm able to scroll through it, I'll see, this one went off first before these other ones went off. So you'll actually know that on these addressable panels. Then you have these things over here that are conventional. So if I take, say, the same apartment, so an older apartment complexes may have these conventional fire alarms. This is going to give me that zoning, which we have on the floor level. So say 1, 2, 3. So if I had a fire on level 2, then essentially it's going to come up as zone 2. So it's going to show me that, okay, floor 2 is on fire. It won't tell me exactly where, like an addressable does. It's not going to give me a sequence. So if all of a sudden I have zone 2 that goes in, and the same zone someone decides to do a pull station, well, it's still going to be zone 2. It's not going to change any difference. It's not going to say zone 2 now, zone 2 this. It's just going to stay at one level. Okay, so addressable systems are used in many new apartment complexes because of their ability to quickly locate the fire and assist first responders. Okay, conventional systems have been used in existing apartment complexes, but they are still heavily used within commercial buildings that just need to zone the location. So if I have a sprinkler system in some of these buildings, I may also have a fire alarm system, depending on the size of these buildings. And that fire alarm system may say, okay, well, you're zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this is what you're called. That's it. It's not going to be very specific like these addressable systems, because you don't have to be, right? You're just saying it's in this retail, or it's going to be in this commercial, if somewhere something else. That's kind of how they're set up. So it's always a good idea to ask the owner or their representative, so when you're out in the field, what type of fire alarm system is installed, and if they can obtain any of the history. So for instance, if they say, yeah, it's an addressable system, great. Can you pull that history for me? Can I see kind of that sequence of operation that went on within that for that fire alarm system? Is what exactly transpired, during that time? Okay, so that's a great part of these addressables compared to these conventional systems. Okay, now fixed fire protection systems. This is kind of the last active system I'll get into today. So fixed fire protection systems, we're typically around a lot, but pay very little or no attention to. And these systems you see a lot of these around restaurant cooking operations. So anything that contributes to grease-laden vapors may or will require a fixed fire suppression system. Okay, so it depends. Currently, the only system that is listed to be used in commercial operations. So currently the systems that are listed, we have wet chemical systems. Those are the ones that are actually listed for these restaurant systems. So for new systems, we would use the Ontario Building Code. So part 6 of the Ontario Building Code is 6226, so that's the article. And then this article would direct you to, we call it NFP 96. All that means is that's a standard for these systems. So that's the standard for ventilation control and fire protection of commercial cooking operations. And that's going to lead me into other things like NFPA 17A, for instance, for these wet systems that I was talking about, right? So, but that's the standard that it would bring me to, okay? So for existing commercial cooking operations, we would use the Ontario Fire Code. Remember I talked about new, now we talk about existing. So how does that work? Is that we would actually use a fire code. So in this case, the Ontario base would be Article 26112, and I know the national also has stuff built out in it as well, and everywhere else, because they really adopt that national model code, and it's the same thing. So it's going to tell you to go to 96. So you're going to look for the maintenance of these is going to be the big key, but that's especially for the existing systems. They still have to maintain them. They still have to be in conformance to NFP 96 for the installation parameters, and which is going to bring it to that NFP 17A, which all that means is that wet chemical standard for the actual design of the suppression system itself, okay? So now we're going to get on to how are they applied to a claim. So I'm sure that's what everybody's thinking is, oh, okay, great, there's a lot of information. Where's the relevance, right? So how does this apply to me? So also note there are many other fire protection systems that we did not focus on because of our limited time, okay? So because of that, the system that we focused on are the fundamentals of what we are more than likely to encounter in the industry. And how can we apply the code to help our claim scenario? Okay, so here we have a case study. So this here is for an industrial building, so building classification F2, okay? So if we're looking at an F2 major occupancy, so all that means is that it's a medium industrial occupancy, okay? Typically, it has more than approximately, so this is just a number, 50 kilograms per meter squared. That's the building code definition of what they consider as an F2 of combustible material, okay? So yes, there's some calculation that goes into these. This F2 building has multiple tenanted spaces used as repair shops, so also known as mechanic shops, okay? So for the purpose of disclosure, for this particular case, we will refer to bays 1 and 2 as tenant 1, so this is bays 1 and 2, and bay 3, 4, 5 as tenant 2. So tenant 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? So if we look at here, other bays, of course, were affected, but did not play a pivotal role in the fire spread. So a worker from tenant 2 discovered smoke emitting from tenant 1 shortly after 911 was contacted and fire crews arrived and suppressed the fire. A fire investigator from the Office of the Fire Marshal, OFM, was contacted to investigate the origin, cause, and circumstances of the fire event. Once the investigation was completed by the OFM, the insurance company contacted a fire investigator from origin and cause to examine the incident. Okay, so that's kind of the background story of this. So here I have this is a quick video that really depicts what transpired. It's just kind of to show you the events that took place, okay? Okay, short video, but again, that was just to show you kind of what we're dealing with in this particular case here. So upon examination, the fire investigator discovered that tenant 1, so we talked about tenant 1, and 2 were separated by a wall constructed of plywood. So this is kind of where all of a sudden now I'm getting involved into the mix, okay? So the pre-fire photo depicts a combustible wood wall. So we have here that wood wall that separated tenant 1 and 2. The post-fire depicts an open area void of any wall. So if we look at the post-fire, where did the wall go, right? So we have it here, but it's not here. So the wood wall was constructed to separate both the tenanted spaces. Okay, so that actually here was to separate tenant 1 and tenant 2. That's why they put that wood wall in. Okay. So here we go. Okay, so we have a wood wall. What act and regulation would we use to address this? So let's break down which one we would use. So for instance, okay, we have the building code. Okay, so the Ontario Building Code has set a minimum standard for the design and construction of these new buildings for additions, alterations, and change of use of existing buildings in the province of Ontario, or the fire code. So the fire code applies across Ontario and consists of a set of minimum requirements for fire safety within and around existing buildings and facilities. Okay, so obviously, so this case study is about existing buildings, but the wall was an addition. So because it was existing building, but the wall was an addition, the winner of this would actually be the Ontario Building Code because it wasn't in there originally. It was an addition that was put into the existing building. Okay, so that's where we would use the building code rather than just go open up the fire code and say, oh, okay, well, why can't we use this? Because it wasn't there ever to begin with from that original design, okay? So here we have the passive fire protection, fire separations, okay? So earlier we discussed passive fire protection systems. So in this case study, we look at the fire separations. So I have 2 suites, and suites is defined in the building code as a single room or series of rooms of complementary use, so operated under a single tenancy. Okay, a tenancy in the context of the term suite, so that really applies to both the rental and ownership. Okay, the 2 suites prior to the fire are separated by a combustible wall. And if I examine the code, I come across this article right here. So this 3355, repair garage separations. So this actually tells me, if we read through it, it actually tells me that, hey, you know what? It needs to be separated from all their occupancies from a fire separation, having a fire resistance rating of not less than 2 hours. And if I look what this is and I compare it to, say, this is my example, okay? So the example of a 2-hour rated wall assembly doesn't really look much like this now, does it, right? And again, this is only an example. There's other 2-hour rated wall assemblies, but this is just an example of what I'm trying to show you, that doesn't really appear that we have that 2-hour rating that we should have, okay? So how do we get to this point? First, we would have to kind of dive into the Ontario Building Code. So what exactly is a fire separation? Okay. So we look at fire separation means a construction assembly that acts as a barrier against the spread of fire. Okay. And the second part of it is really a fire resistance ratings are required as part of the assembly. So Article 3171 is what we're seeing here, sentence 1 and 2 are the prescribed requirements as per the building code. So if we look here, we look at, so the first one we talk about, remember that listing, I showed some pictures of what a actual fire resistance rating listing wall looks like. So that's ULC S101. So that's this guy here in sentence 1, it talks about that. And then the second one, we talk about a material assembly of materials or structural materials. So we talk about this basis, supplementary standard SB2. So that comes right out of the building code. So we have an option of this listed requirement here, or we have an option of that supplementary standard, okay? One thing to note is that, say for instance, they said to me that we designed this, it's fine, we did it to the SB2, just for instance, okay? Well, there are limitations as to when you can use this compared to having something just tested. So the maximum fire resistance rating, so if we read through this, so we see the walls, the cold form steel studs, floors, wood joists, all that stuff. But when we keep reading through it, we come to not more than 90 minutes from the information in this subsection. So that becomes a problem. So we go, okay, 2 hours, 90 minutes, That's not adding up at all, right? So we only have an hour and a half max. So how would that be even possible? So again, now we're jumping into more of a listed system, right? Is what we're not getting. So when you look at that before, that requirement would say, okay, I guess we're going to need a fire separation and requirements to do a listed system for that case study. Okay. So really, when it comes down to it, if we took that same case study and said, okay, well, when should we get a code analysis done? Really, that comes to any time a fire occurs and an active or passive fire protection system appear to have failed. So anytime those systems appear to have failed, that's more or less when you go, okay, you know what, something doesn't seem right. I think I need to look into this a little bit further. Okay, that's kind of where that would come into for that type of analysis. And I know a big question that everybody has is who's responsible for code compliance, okay? So let's look at kind of these responsible parties. So who's really responsible? So we look at owners, general contractors, developers, contractors, property managers, tenants, landlords, etc. So there's a lot of different responsibilities that it could come to. So let's break this down a little bit more. So responsible person and or corporation. So if you look at owners, so unless otherwise specified, the owner is responsible for carrying out the provisions of this code. That's fire code. And then the building code talks about for permits, right? Obviously, because building codes, more or less new stuff. So we're always looking at permits. And these permits say the owner includes in respect of the property on which the construction or demolition will take place. It says the registered owner, a leasee, and a mortgage in possession. So if we looked at, maybe let's look at contractors and property managers. So how would they fit into this? So one, if we look here, we have owner. So means in the fire code, it means any person, firm, corporation having control over any portion of the building or property under consideration. That includes the persons in the building or property. Okay, so it's a little bit more opened up now when we actually look at what the term owner comes to. So that's where we start looking into, okay, so we have property managers, or maybe under that care and control, hey, could it have been a contractor that had care and control over the system that they were using? Were they the owners in regards to the definition of that system at that time, right? So overall, owners are held responsible, yes, to be in conformance with the code, but as I stated earlier, responsible owners, so they've done everything, they did their due diligence, they did everything that were required of them, but they may have not have had a responsible property manager or a contractor, right? So we can't always say you're to blame, owner, even though you did everything you're supposed to, it's your fault. No, that's why we kind of break those up a little bit, okay? And then if we look here, landlord is responsible. The reason why I put that in there is just to kind of show you how we break that up even further. So if you have a rental suite, this really goes into smoke alarms. Okay, so the owner has to make sure that at least the tenant at the time they move in, and while they're there, that at least they have an operational smoke alarm. Okay, whether or not that tenant actually keeps it up there is a different story. That falls back onto the tenant if they decide to destroy it or take it down. But while it's in there, that owner, so that landlord is responsible to make sure it's there and to at least try to document it somewhere, because that's going to be the key thing. So the next thing is the building code. So now, obviously, building code permit application, right? So again, we look at that. What we looked at before is the owner, right? So the registered owner, leasing, mortgagee, or possession. So you got to remember, the owner is responsible to maintain that permit process, but just because the owner is responsible for the permit process doesn't mean that they are held 100% accountable. So for instance, if you look at a general contractor or someone in that facet who actually takes ownership, so is delegated by the owner to complete those steps, would I now go to the general contractor for that information? So how about if a contractor completes work in a building without a permit? Well, the contractor who does work for a living for that type of stuff should also understand they can't do work in there without a permit, okay? The owner is still held liable, of course, if that's the case with work without a permit, but the contractor, as you can tell, can also be held liable for commencing the work without a permit in place, okay? So just keep that note as well. So there is a lot of complexity when we deal around responsibility and the ownership of each individual, because we can't just all of a sudden always say owner, owner, owner. I get it, owner's responsible all the time, but then we have to keep breaking it down to what the owner did and was it the next step going forward, who had care and control over that particular area or thing at that given time that caused the problem. Where did this happen? So that's kind of doing that root cause analysis to go down the chain to see where did it come from? How did that come to that failed? Okay. So that was kind of the biggest portion of it, and we'll jump into questions here.
Hey, thanks so much, Clinton. Yeah, we got some questions. We're also a little short on time, but let's dive in. And if anyone has anything, please feel free to submit them now. So this one was submitted pretty early on. What about buildings that are built a few code updates back? Do they have to update at title change or under any other circumstances? So this was around the building code, fire code portion of the presentation.
Yeah, so it really depends. Like there is some complexity to the existing portion of it, because if we look at existing buildings, we have to apply. So the fire code, again, that's the retroactive part of it, right? As far as it goes for title changes, that's more or less with the city that's going to be looking at, okay, so who has the ownership of that for the title, right? That's really all it comes to. And then there's a planning process for those titles, right? So depending on what you want to do with those for changing it or whatnot. Really, when it comes to those existing structures, that's where you're going to have to look into those retroactive requirements that there's no grandfathering to. That's the fire code provisions, okay, that stick in. And depending on the construction at the time that those buildings took place, you'll also have to backtrack a little bit further to see, okay, well, did something happen in the design process? Did it not meet something? What did the authority or having jurisdiction approve? And maybe there's something done that they didn't know. So a lot of the time, a lot of these places have construction done without a permit, like we just saw, that goes under the radar, that there will be no records for. So that's where we have to look at those existing buildings. Was it even there to begin with? Should it even have been there to begin with? So there's a lot of kind of things that we have to break down. That's why I call it complexity with that type of question, because there's a lot of different layers that you can actually approach it. Hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah, I think so. What about renovations to existing buildings?
So if you do any type of renovation, so you have to look at the building code part of it. So we call that part 10 and 11, right? So change of use. So if we're looking at kind of that change of use and renovation aspect to it, well, that's going to jump you right back into the building code, right? So that's not fire code. So if I have a building that, say, in retrofit within a fire code provision is telling me that you have to do X, Y, and Z, that still has to go through a permit process. Now you'd have to meet fire code provisions, because remember, fire code's retroactive and it's telling you you need to do this, therefore you get a permit to do this, but it's under the fire code. But if it goes back and says, well, it never existed to begin with, well, then all of a sudden it jumps you back into building code, right? So you got to look at what it is, what code actually kicks in, so which one you have to work. And those renovations, obviously, if it's a new renovation, that's going to kick you right into the building code. And then you have to look at how old the building is. If it's greater than 5 years, that's going to let you go to part 11 of the building code. If it's a change of use because of those renovations, well, now you need a permit for the change of use. That's going to pull up a whole bunch of other things in that change of use permit. And then you're going to look at that renovations to go, okay, well, it's older than 5 years. What am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? So there's a little bit more complexities in that part as well, because it really depends on what that renovation is changing. Okay.
Okay, fantastic. Here's one. So if an owner hires a fire suppression maintenance company, does that delegate responsibility for the operation of the suppression system to the maintenance company, or is the owner of the building always responsible?
So I think I touched base on that later in the slide. So that's why we looked at that care and control facet. Okay, so I do have experience where I have charged someone in the past when I was working with the fire service. I can't give you the information, but there was a contractor. And the reason why is because the contractor themselves knowingly did perform work where they shouldn't have done it. So they were under care and control over that particular system. So they were hired, the owner did their due diligence, but then it went back to the contractor because the contractor is now the owner of the system at the time that they have actually performed the work. So remember, we looked at those definitions of what it looked like in the fire code. That's where it kind of comes back to as well. So now we're looking at, okay, well, you did the work, you performed it, but you didn't do the work that you're supposed to. So the owner, remember, the owner's always held responsible, yes, but only to the accounts that the owner has control over, which is hiring them, who are the experts, and they're the ones who are supposed to be taking control of the system and making sure that they're doing everything they're supposed to do. So that's where we have to kind of separate those two and look at that care and control and the ownership at the time that it was actually done. So that's also complexity as well, because you're breaking down the layers to see, okay, who was responsible? Did the owner not do it? Did the contractor not do it? Did the subcontractor not do what they're supposed to? Where did this fail? Right? That's kind of that root cause that I was talking about.
Fantastic. Okay, let's try and get one more in before we say goodbye. So, what if the fire suppression system was not required under the current use of the building? Was not required under the current use of the building, but it was not properly decommissioned and was still present. Then a fire occurs and it does not operate properly. Can the owner rely on the fact that it was not required at the time?
That's actually kind of funny because there are provisions for the decommissioning of a system that relies on the actual fire code itself. So any decommissioning of a fire protection system, you have to meet fire code provisions, and you have to get authority through the actual chief fire official. So a lot of the time that's the fire chief itself, or the designated person is usually the chief fire prevention officers. So there is a provision in there because of that decommissioning process. Because you have a system, you have to treat the system as it's a live system and continue the maintenance and inspections of the system. If the system itself doesn't operate as intended during the fire scenario, did you go through the decommissioning process and the approvals and acceptance from the authority having jurisdiction? So that's where you have to look at that. So you can't just go ahead and readily take out a system because you think you don't need it. You have to go through a process because it was there and designed for the system. And even a voluntary system under the building code, we have to look at those provisions too, because even a voluntary system doesn't matter because you still have to design it when you use the building code to the provisions of the building code, even for a voluntary system. The only system that you don't have to, that looks at a voluntary setup, is when you deal with standpipe systems where it was never needed. And that's actually spelt out within the appendix of the actual building code. But every other system out there requires you to meet one, the building code. So make sure the building code of the day for even a voluntary system that goes in, because you still have to meet a requirement when you put it in there. So NFPA 13, or it could be ULC 524 for fire alarms. And then if you want to take the system out afterwards, that's where you actually need to talk to, that's where the fire code kicks in. Remember, we talked about existing and we talked about new construction, like what's considered existing, what's considered new. So that's where the fire code kicks in for the decommissioning processes. So that's where you have to still get the approval of the authority having jurisdiction, because they themselves also should know that there's no system. Because if I show up to a fire sprinkler system and I expect it, and people also expect that it's a system's going to work and it's there and it's not, well, then that due diligence responsibility falls back to the owner, that they did not follow the process that's required. So hopefully that kind of, I know it's a lot of information, but hopefully that kind of sums it up.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have. So any other questions, we'll get back to you via email. Actually, Clinton, can I just get you to advance to the next slide, just because your contact info is there. If anyone does think of a question an hour from now or a week from now, you can direct it directly to Clinton at cdebroy@origin-and-cause.com. And I'll just say thank you, Clinton. Fantastic presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a great day. And like we said at the top of the presentation, when you close out the GoToWebinar control panel, you're going to be prompted to fill out a survey. We'd love your feedback. And you'll also be asked if you'd like to be registered for the national tour, which is taking place October 26th. So you can just click yes, and we'll be signed up automatically, and you won't have to go through that. And then you'll receive all the info via email. So